So hello and welcome to this NPTEL lecture on this course Introduction to Cultural Studies, and we're looking at Judith Butler. So we had finished the text Judith Butler's Gender Trouble in the last lecture. So we covered the content in terms of looking at the important sections for us for the purpose of this particular course. So what we'll do today, we'll look at the conclusion of that book. It's really a very seminal book, as I keep saying. It's one of those books which connect postmodernism with gender studies and post-structuralism. So it does a lot of things in terms of its impact on critical theory and its impact on cultural studies. So it's very important that we look at the conclusion in some details, and we look at the conclusion and so we read the entire conclusion actually in this particular lecture and the one to come as well, where she talks about how not to look at gender. I mean, she shows us how to look at gender, of course, but also how not to look at gender. And also, interestingly, she looks at a way in which some of the supposed constrictions in terms of gender studies can actually be seen as positives. So some of the supposed ambiguities in gender studies can be seen as possibilities. And that's one of the really radical things which that particular conclusion does. And also, it really summarizes the whole book, Gender Trouble. It talks about how gender trouble draws on Foucault, draws on Irigaray, draws on Simone de Beauvoir, and also draws on, to a great extent, post-structuralism. So it's a good section to look at in terms of looking at the entire text, but also, and equally, in terms of looking at how gender identities are played out and proliferated and produced in culture, in popular culture, discursive conditions, ideological conditions, etc. Okay, so this should be on the screen at the moment. It's a conclusion and it's called From Parody to Politics. And before I sort of dive into it, if you remember, she had made a very crucial distinction between parody and pastiche in one of the sections in the main text, which we studied. And she had drawn on Frederick Jameson, and she sort of examined pastiche as a hollow parody, as a parody which has been exhausted of laughter. And pastiche is sort of different ontologically from parody because it doesn't assume any ontological origin. So parody assumes an ontological origin. Parody assumes an original center against which the parodic production is measured up. Whereas pastiche doesn't assume any ontological center, any ontological origin at all. So pastiche is more hollow than parody. It is a parody which is an exhaustion of laughter, but also that exhaustion becomes a subversion to a certain extent. And that's an important definition that Butler draws on and expands on towards the end of Gender Trouble. Now, in this particular section entitled Conclusion from Parody to Pastiche, some Parody to Politics, she talks about how politics can be produced, so political identities can be produced through parody, and how parody can performatively produce political identities and sub-identities and counter-identities as opposed to the hegemonic discourses which contain identities as in relation to gender. Okay, so she starts this particular section by rehearsing some of the questions that she had already raised in Gender Trouble. She says, I began with a speculative question of whether feminist politics could do without a subject in the category of woman, right? So, I mean, we've seen how she had warned us against, repeatedly warned us against any universalizing tendency and a totalizing tendency in terms of looking at woman, the woman, and offering instead so the plural possibilities that can come with the subject position of woman. At stake is not whether it still makes sense, strategically or transitionally, to refer to woman in order to make representational claims on the behalf. The feminist we is always and only a phantasmatic construction, one that has its purposes, but one which denies the internal complexity and indeterminacy of the term and constitutes itself only through the exclusion of some part of the constituency that it simultaneously seeks to represent. So she looks at a paradox in representation and feminism, and she says the question of we becomes very important. Who are this we? And this entire idea of we in feminist politics is based on a certain degree of exclusion, right? It excludes certain elements which paradoxically it sets out to represent, sets out to promote, right? So there is a paradox in the question of agency, in the question of location, and a question of representation in feminism. So it ends up being, and she says, it's always a phantasmatic construction. It's a construction of fantasy. It can never be an entire construction. It can never be a total construction. And also, and equally, and more importantly, she goes on to say that this is actually marked by internal complexity and indeterminacy, which ends up excluding certain subjects, excluding certain components which feminism sets out to represent. Right? So therein lies a paradox in representation. Therein lies a paradox of the subject position in feminism that she is sort of interrogating and trying to deconstruct. So the tenuous or phantasmatic status of the we, however, is not the cause for despair, or at least it is not only cause for despair. The radical instability of the category sets into question the foundational restrictions on feminist political theorizing and opens up other configurations, not only of genders and bodies, but of politics itself. So this is what I meant when I sort of said at the very beginning of this particular lecture, that one of the really radical things which this particular conclusion does is that it looks at certain supposed shortcomings of subject position, representation, agency, some of the constrictions, some of the shortcomings, some of the pitfalls of these things, and looks at those things in terms of privileges, in terms of possibilities. So she's saying over here that there's an indeterminacy, there's an ambiguity in the question of we, in the category of we in feminist politics. So who are these we? What constitutes as we? Obviously, we works with exclusion, we works with paradoxes, internal complexities, internal ambiguities. It doesn't include certain things which it sets out to represent, etc. So there is a problem. It's a problematic category. However, she goes on to say over here that this problematic category, or this acknowledgement, or this discovery of the problem, it should not be the cause for despair alone. Right? So we should not despair at the fact that there's an ambiguity in the question of we, there's a complexity, there's a paradox in the question of we in feminist politics, but rather we should look at this ambiguity in terms of possibility, in terms of opening up more possibilities, plural possibilities in foundational politics. And this is what she says in the end, the radical instability, and this instability, this indeterminacy can have radical possibilities emerging out of it. So the radical instability of the category sets into question the foundational restrictions on feminist political theorizing and opens up other configurations, not only of genders and bodies, but of politics itself. Okay, so this can become possibilities not just in terms of gender and bodies, but also politics itself. So politics, of course, over here is an umbrella term which includes representation, agency, body, identity, everything really. Okay. So, and then she goes on to say, the foundationalist reasoning of identity politics tends to assume that an identity must first be in place in order for political interests to be elaborated and subsequently political action to be taken, right? So, and this is one of those a priori definitions of identity, which obviously Butler goes on to critique and deconstruct. And she says over here that is foundationalist reasoning of identity politics. The dominant rationale behind identity politics assumes, what does it assume? It assumes that identity is a pre-discursive phenomenon. That's what she says over here. That, it tends to assume that identity must first be in place in order for political interests to be elaborated and subsequently political action to be taken. So identity comes before political action, according to the dominant rationale of identity politics. Identity comes before political interests. Identity comes before political motivations, before discursive motivations. However, she says quite clearly in subsequent sections over here, almost immediately after this, that identity is actually part of the production principle. Identity cannot exist a priori. Identity cannot be a pre-discursive phenomenon. It is very much a product of discursive phenomenon. It's part of the discursive phenomenon. So identity is very much, sort of synchronized or a part of or embedded in the entire idea of discursivity, right? So identity and discursivity are allied together, embedded together, organically related together, and you cannot really sort of siphon out one from the other. Okay, which is what the ordinary foundationalist rationale of identity does. So she is questioning and deconstructing the foundationalist reasoning of identity, which assumes identity to be a pre-discursive given. Instead, she says over here that identity is very much a part of the discursive politics, discursive production. So identity is discourse. So identity and discursivity are simultaneous, synchronous, and a part of each other. They complement each other in human situations. And then she says over here, my argument, and this is what she says, is that there need not be a doer behind the deed, but that a doer is variably constructed in and through the deed. And that's really a beautiful way to put it. And she says the doer and the deed are, they're part of the same thing, they're part of the same process. So the action and the actant, they are part of each other. they are they inform each other, they are entangled with each other. And again, it's an asymmetric entanglement. So the foundationalist reasoning of identity, the dominant rationale of identity production, which is obviously discursive in quality, it conceals this entanglement of doer and deed. It sort of says that a doer comes before the deed, that identity precedes discursivity, identity precedes ideological interests, identity precedes discursive interests. But Butler says quite clearly over here, and this is a very post-structuralist thing to say, that identity and action, the doer and the deed, are entangled with each other. They are part of the same process. So the doer is produced by the deed is produced by the doer. There's no ontological difference, there's no ontological separation between these two categories. Okay. And then she goes on to say, this is not a return to an existential theory of the self as constituted through its acts. This is the classic existentialist idea, that existence precedes essence, etc. But this is what she says. She says, I'm not going back and falling back upon existentialist theory that existence precedes essence. She's not saying that, because she says quite clearly that for the existential theory maintains a pre-discursive structure for both the self and its acts. So she's against any idea of pre-discursivity. To put it very bluntly, she says that there's nothing that can be pre-discursive. Everything is part of the discursive process. So she says that existentialism, despite saying that existence precedes essence, because it says existence precedes essence, actually separates out or maps out the self and the action. It looks at self as a pre-discursive phenomenon, and obviously Butler has problems with that, because according to Butler, the self is very much a product of a discursive phenomenon. The self and discursivity are entangled together, identity and discursivity are entangled together in the same complex process. So there can't be any separation, any ontological or epistemological separation between identity and discursivity. Okay, so the self cannot be preceding the essence, the self cannot be preceding the idea of discourse. So, and then she says, it is precisely the discursively variable construction of each and through the other that has interested me here. So, they are discursively informed. The self and the doer and the deed, they are all discursively informed, discursively invested, in different ways, in very complex ways. Okay. Now, if you come to page 182, the next page from this particular section, where she starts looking at agency as a very important category. So the question of locating agency is usually associated with the viability of the subject, where the subject is understood to have some stable existence prior to the cultural field that it negotiates. So the key word over here is prior. And obviously Butler is going to debunk the theory. Butler is going to shoot down the theory, or shoot down any idea of a priori existence, right? So, and she says the usual association between agency and subjectivity works this way, that, the subject is understood to be, have a stable existence prior to discourse, prior to the cultural field it negotiates. But for Butler, the subject and the discursive field are part of the same process. They are always entangled with each other. They're always involved with each other. They're always dialogic with each other. They're part of the same process, and we cannot possibly separate or make an epistemological separation between the subject and the discursive field. The subject is a discursive field, the discursive field is a subject. They inform each other, they feed into each other in more ways than one. Okay. And then she says the dominant way of looking at the conventional way of looking at subjects says that if the subject is culturally constructed, it is nevertheless vested with agency, usually figured as a capacity for reflexive meditation or mediation that remains intact regardless of its cultural embeddedness. Okay, so again, the normative way of looking at agency and subjectivity, it says that the subject has a degree of immunity from discursivity, if you can put it that way, or has a degree of insularity from discursivity. It is not. It remains intact. There's an integrity of the subject that is not discursive in quality. However, Butler contests that immediately away, and she says, there cannot be an integrity which is pre-discursive or which is non-discursive or discursive, right? There can be no such thing as a discursive subject. So every subject formation is discursive in quality, is ideological in quality, is cultural in quality, and you cannot possibly separate out the subject from the cultural field. You cannot invest any romantic or reifying idea of integrity or interiority which is not discursive in quality. So every form of subjectivity, every flavor of subjectivity is discursive in quality. There's no pure interiority, there's no pure integrity which is discursive in quality, and that's a myth that Butler goes on to debunk. Okay, on such a model, culture and discourse mire the subject but do not constitute the subject. So, if you look at the normative understanding of subjectivity and agency, Butler says that on such a model, the normative, the dominant model of looking at the subject, it says the culture and discourse mire the subject, they inform the subject, but they do not constitute the subject. So the subject has a degree of romantic separation, a degree of existential separation from discourse, from the entire idea of culture, right? So culture and discourse inform the subject, but the subject has a state of separatedness from culture and discourse. According to the dominant theory, the subject has a degree of autonomy compared to the idea of discourse, compared to the idea of culture. So there are certain elements, certain components of the subject which are discursive in quality, which are not cultural in quality, which are purely existential in quality. But obviously, Butler is saying all this because she'll go on to deconstruct this and interrogate this and refute this quite radically very soon. This move to qualify and admire the pre-existing subject has appeared necessary to establish a point of agency that is not fully determined by that culture and discourse. So again, the normal conventional way of looking at agency is to say there is an agency which is not fully informed, fully determined by culture and discourse, right? So there's a degree of agency which is separated, which enjoys the luxury of separation from culture, the luxury of separation from discourse, right? That's the conventional understanding of agency, apropos of discourse and culture. And yet, this kind of reasoning falsely presumes that A, agency can only be established through recourse to a prediscursive I, even if that I is found in the midst of a discursive convergence, and B, that to be constituted by discourse is to be determined by discourse, where determination forecloses the possibility of agency. So she's pointing out the paradoxes in this particular definition, where she says that there is a claim, there's a theory that agency can only be reestablished, can be established through recourse to a prediscursive I. There's a prediscursive I which exists. And it's only that prediscursive I which can emerge, which can produce agency, a pure agency, right? And that I can be in convergence with discourses, with intersect with ideologies, intersect with discourses, etc. So, but then at the same time, there's a prediscursive I which exists at a romantic remove from discourses, at a romantic remove from culture. And B, that to be constituted by discourse is to be determined by discourse, where determination forecloses the possibility of agency. There's a paradox that Butler is pointing out over here. So she's saying, on one hand, this theory says there's a prediscursive I, and on the other hand, she's saying to be constituted by discourse is to be determined by discourse, and determination forecloses the possibility of agency. Right, so there's a degree of overdetermination of discourse. So she's saying, she's pointing out the paradox, the contradiction, and this kind of a definition of agency and discursivity, where she says, on one hand, there's a claim, there's a prediscursive I. On the other hand, there's also a very blunt statement that the subject is considered by discourse to the extent that it's determined by the discourse, where any other act of agency is foreclosed. That determination forecloses any possibility of agency. So therein lies a contradiction in this particular theory. Okay. And then she goes on to say, even within the theories that maintain a highly qualified or situated subject, the subject still encounters its discursively constituted environment in an oppositional epistemological frame. So she goes on to say that there is there are certain other theories where the subject is situated or immersed in discourses, etc. But however, even within those theories, the subject encounters its discursively constituted environment in oppositional and epistemological frame. In other words, what that means is the subject exists at an opposition to agency, an opposition to discourse, an opposition to discursive environment. And so the subject and the discursive environment are not entangled with each other. The subject is not part of the environment per se, but the subject negotiates the environment, the discursive environment, as an oppositional frame, as an oppositional epistemological frame. So again, we are back to saying there's this pure I, there's a pre-discursive I, there's a discursive I, which negotiates the discursive field as an oppositional category, right? So, that is another theory that Butler is pointing out and highlighting. the culturally admired subject negotiates its constructions, even when those constructions are the very predicates of its own identity, right? So, and then she goes on to say that the culturally constructed subject negotiates with its construction. So again, the constructed subject and the pure self are opposition relation to each other over here. So the pure self, the culturally admired subject, is negotiating with construction. So in other words, the constructions and the self are removable with each other, and they are in epistemological opposition with each other. That's something that Butler is pointing out. Okay, and then she goes on to look at how Beauvoir had talked about talked about the different ways in which the feminine subject can be seen as the other, can be seen as in relation, as an opposition relation to a patriarchal frame, etc. And then she goes on to say, through this horizontal trajectory of adjectives, these positions strive to encompass a situated subject, but invariably fail to complete it. And then she says in page 182, there are theories of feminist identity that elaborate predicates of color, sexuality, ethnicity, class, and able-bodiedness invariably close with an embarrass, etc. at the end of the list. So, when she says that the theories of feminist subjectivity or feminist identity, when they are listing the variables in identity, they come up with color, which is race, sexuality, ethnicity, class, and able-bodiedness, whether it's an able-bodied female or a differently able female, etc. So all these variables come into being, and then she says at the end of this list of variables is always an embarrassed, etc. Which means that this particular list is potentially limitless. It can just go on forever. So what that means, obviously, is the feminist idea of identity has its ambiguities, internal ambiguities, or internal complexities, or internal limitlessness. It cannot be a total definition. It cannot be a complete definition. However, this is exactly which Butler points out and then draws on, and says that, this potential limitlessness can actually be a possibility, can actually be, some kind of a plurality of possibilities which will open up, closed doors which will resist any kind of closure. Okay. Then she says, through this horizontal trajectory of adjectives, these positions strive to encompass a situated subject, but invariably fail to be complete. So the idea of the situated female subject doesn't have a complete list of variables. So it has variables such as race, color, ethnicity, language, sexuality, able-bodiedness, etc. And then there's an etc. in the end, which says it can go on forever. So it fails to be complete. However, for Butler, this failure to be complete is actually a radical possibility. It says this failure that it doesn't complete at all means, in some sense, it resists closure. It resists a closure of definition, which means it can potentially be limitless. And this limitlessness can actually be a radical possibility, according to Butler, which she says quite clearly a way up, where she says, this failure, however, is instructive. What political impetus is to be derived from this exasperated etc. that so often occurs at the end of such lines. So she says, is there any political impetus that can be drawn, that can be derived from this exasperated etc., which comes to the end of this feminist identity, at the end of the variables constituting feminist identity, right? And she says this particular failure, the supposed failure, this ontological, epistemological failure to determine the feminist identity can actually be instructive politically. It can actually offer, it can invest itself into the politics of representation more radically. And she says quite clearly, this is a sign of exhaustion, as well as of the illimitable process of signification itself, right? So this is illimitable, right? It's limitless. It's exhaustion, yes, it just goes on forever. At the same time, it is also limitless. So this illimitable process of signification is something that Butler is quite keen on. And obviously, if you look at this phrase, illimitable process of signification, this is a classic post-structuralist phrase, right? It says that this possibility of meaning, this possibility of variables, possibility of production of identities is potentially limitless. And this limitless potential is actually subversive in quality because it will resist any kind of closure. It will not be it will not be so dogmatically determined by certain presuppositions, by certain predetermined variables. The variables are the very process of production. The variables are produced by the definition. So the definition produces its paradoxes. The definition produces its openings, its possibilities. It's an open definition. It will never be a closed definition. So when on one hand, that lack of closure, the lack of closed definition can be an exhaustion, can be an exasperation, can be frustration. But at the same time, this lack of closure, this lack of a dogmatic ending to the definition can actually be a possibility of radical production, which can go on ad infinitum, just go on limitlessly. Okay, so this illimitable process of signification that Butler talks about is a very important phrase. That is classically a post-structuralist way of looking at representation, right? So representation of the feminist identity, the feminist subject, is illimitable process. It's an illimitable process of signification that Butler draws on. She hammers home the point, and she's sometimes someone who celebrates it. And this is a very postmodernist kind of a celebration, which again brings us back to this idea of Butler being a postmodernist feminist, a postmodernist gender theorist, right? Because she looks at the ambiguity of representation, the ambiguity of signification, or the endlessness of signification, not as a cause for lament, not as a cause for tragedy. That there's no closure, there's no universal idea of the feminist identity. There's no consensus in the idea of feminist identity. However, the lack of consensus, the lack of a universalizing idea becomes for Butler a possibility, a radical possibility of plural production, or the plurality of production, in other words. Okay, and she defines this illimitable process of signification as a supplement. She says it's a supplement, the excess that necessarily accompanies any effort to posit identity once and for all, right? So this is a supplement, an excess, which is actually a very healthy excess, a very healthy supplement that necessarily accompanies any effort to posit identity once and for all. The illimitable etc., however, offers itself as a new departure for feminist political theorizing. So this could be a healthy, radical, subversive departure for feminist political theorizing, this idea of an illimitable process of signification. And that's something which is celebrated by Butler. She says that this should not be seen necessarily as a constriction, necessarily as a restriction in terms of the ontological possibility of feminist identity, but rather this idea of a limitless variable, limitless signification can actually open up the idea of feminist identity ad infinitum. It can take up new meaning at different points of time and different spatio-temporal conditions, at different cultural conditions. It can just keep producing its paradoxes, keep producing its open-endedness. So this idea of the feminist identity being an open-ended identity, being an identity which defines itself through its limitlessness of definition is not really a tragedy, is not really a cause for concern for Butler, but rather it becomes a cause for celebration for Butler. I mean, she celebrates this illimitable idea of feminist identity. So it's a definition which keeps producing its open-endedness. It keeps producing its exits. It keeps producing its etceteras, in other words, right? So its etceteras become discursive in quality according to Butler's theorizing. Okay. So, and then she goes on to say, if identity is asserted through a process of signification, if identity is always already signified, and yet continuously signify as it circulates within various interlocking discourses, then the question of agency is not to be answered through recourse to an I that pre-exists signification, right? So she says, if identity is produced by discourses, if identity is already there, at the same time it is produced by discursive formation, discursive reformations, or discursive configurations, then the question of agency must not be sought in a pre-discursive I. So she points out the error. She points out the fallacy of looking at agency as a pre-discursive idea. So again, we're back to saying that identity and discursivity are entangled in Butler. So there's no pre-discursive identity according to Butler. So she said it's a mistake, it's a fallacy to look for a pre-discursive identity, a pre-discursive I, because we're looking at identity as a process of production, right? So there is a set of rules which identity, which informs an understanding of identity. However, those rules are plastic, those rules are, can be produced and reproduced in different cultural conditions, and there's a degree of limitlessness in terms of the variables determining the rules. So that limitlessness for Butler becomes a possibility, becomes a subversive possibility, and that allows her to say that any idea of agency cannot be located at a pre-discursive I. It's a mistake, it's a fallacy, it's an intellectual fallacy to look at a pre-discursive I, a recourse to an I that pre-exists signification. So there cannot be any I which pre-exists or precedes signification. So every I, every identity is produced through a process of signification, right? So signification and identity formation go hand in hand, according to Butler. In other words, the enabling conditions for an assertion of I are provided by the structure of signification. So the very enabling condition which can produce an I are allowed or provided by the structure of signification. So signification and identity formation, they coexist. They don't precede each other, right? They don't follow. There's not a sequential relationship between identity formation and signification. Signification and identity formation are synchronous in terms of quality, in terms of the operation. Okay, the rules that regulate the legitimate and illegitimate invocation of the pronoun, the practices that establish the terms of illegitimacy or illegibility by which the pronoun can circulate. A language is not an exterior medium or instrument into which I pour a self, from which I glean a reflection of that self. So again, language is not to be seen as an external medium, as something which is outside the I, as something which exists post-I, something that the I can come before, etc. Language and I coexist together. So the very process of I formation, the very process of identity formation is through a process of language, through a process of signification through language, right? So there cannot be a pre-linguistic I, right? And that's what she says quite clearly. Language is not an exterior medium, it's not something external to the I, it's very much a part of the I. So again, what she's doing is very post-structuralist. She's blurring the borderlines between the inside and the outside. So the inside and the outside blend together in Butler's idea of language and I, or language and identity. Okay? The Hegelian model of self-recognition that has been appropriated by Marx, Lukács, and a variety of contemporary liberatory discourses presupposes a potential adequation between the I that confronts its world, including its language, as an object, and the I that finds itself as an object in the world. So she's critiquing the Hegelian tradition of looking at identity. So she says the Hegelian tradition, which has been appropriated by Marx and Lukács and lots of other liberatory discourses, it presupposes an I that confronts the world, an I that confronts the objectified world. So there's a subjective I and an objective world, and the I negotiates with the objective world through an act of confrontation. However, Butler says, that model, actually, it has a residual dualism in it. It has a nostalgic dualism in it. It retains a dualistic binaristic structure, which Butler wants to do away with completely. And she says the subject-object dichotomy, which here belongs to the tradition of Western epistemology, conditions the very problematic of identity that it seeks to solve. And this is a very radical statement, and she says that if we really seek to solve the problematic of identity, then we must do away with the dichotomy of the subject and object. And she says the subject-object dichotomy has been, it belongs to the Western metaphysical tradition, the Western epistemological tradition. So you can think of Kant's nomen and phenomenon, you can think of Hegel's self and the other, etc. But that particular tradition must be done away with, according to Butler, if the problematic of identity is to be solved. So she says the Western epistemology is caught in a paradox because it inherits the subject-object dichotomy. It doesn't do away with that completely. It retains that. At the same time, it wants to solve the problematics of identity, and that can't happen unless the subject-object dichotomy is done away with in the first place. So that has to be done away. That has to be deconstructed or debunked in the first place in order for the problematics of identity to be resolved through any kind of a fruitful synthesis. Okay, so I conclude this lecture today with this particular section, but we're looking at a very, very radical way of looking at subjectivity and agency. And obviously the deconstruction over here is for any kind of a pre-discursive given, and a pre-discursive identity, any pre-discursive subjectivity has been done away with and deconstructed by Butler in this really important conclusion to gender trouble, which will continue in the next lecture. Thank you for your attention.